Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Catholic Family News. This is Murray Rundus, the production manager and managing editor here at CFN, and we are here with some somewhat somber, very somber, I will say, political news. Today is June 14th as I record this, and hopefully we get this published in the United States. And this is a day of major significance. We're not exactly sure how it will play out. We have the No Kings protest. It will be a nationwide protest. This is also Donald Trump's birthday, and there is a big military parade commemorating the United States' victory in the Second World War. That's a powder keg in and of itself, all of those events put together. But on June the 13th, and it's played out over the past 2 days, we saw a massive escalation in the Middle East with the Iran and Israel conflict really escalating to a full out war as we currently stand. Now, again, we don't know exactly how this event will play out. We know how it has played out. Um, and we can't really on YouTube talk about the full background and the full future prospects of the war. And so much of this video is going to be on locals. We will be covering the extent of what has happened, what we know has happened, to as much of an extent that we can here on YouTube. Catholic Family News has covered this conflict a lot in the past. We've been covering it really right after the October the 7th massacre that took place. We've been covering the escalation with Israel, Palestine, and the corresponding events that took place in Syria, Lebanon, and then the escalation here in Iran. And YouTube has time and time again really censored our videos for this. We've gotten demonetized. We've gotten our views throttled on this, and it's simply too much of a risk to talk about some of the significant overview that took place before this happened. The significant proceedings that took place before this, the background of the Israeli-Iranian war, and then looking at the future. So we're going to be talking about that over on locals, but really just jumping right into it about what has actually happened. There was a massive Israeli strike on Iran. We didn't know exactly how this took place. We thought this was airstrikes at first. The media did. It now turns out that the initial strikes were due to drones. Massive drone strikes that were able to really assassinate the entirety of the military command structure for Iran. Now, eventually, so we learned that these were drone strikes, and it was surprising in that it seemed that all of Iran's defense systems seemed to just not work. There was simply nothing that could be done. And we learned that this was due to a cyber attack, a massive cyber attack that managed to take out the radar, the detection software that Iran used, and left them, as the Israelis said, blind, deaf, and dumb about what was happening. And so it managed to be a massive strike. There was some attacks on the nuclear facilities, especially in a place called Natanz. But in general, what was attacked was the military structure. You had assassinations that took place mainly against military personnel, and the resources that were attacked were military resources. A big reason for that is because Israel is not able to actually get to many of the nuclear facilities. Many of them are deep underground or in mountains, and Israel simply doesn't have the capability of getting to those with the weaponry that they currently have. But these techniques of leaving the enemies deaf, dumb, and blind is typical for the Israeli warfare. This is how they destroyed Hezbollah, if you remember, with the pager massive military operation that took place that took out all of Hezbollah, just completely eliminated it with and the subsequent assassinations that took place, hiding explosives and pagers, and then just destroying the entire command structure. This kind of subterfuge, this espionage, is something the Israelis have relied on really ever since the beginning of their existence and the establishment of the state of Israel. Now, yesterday morning, we saw a different situation, which shows that this is developing, and it's developing into an entirely different situation, which is that we saw Iran able to shoot down many of the airstrikes that came in. In the initial wave, you had those drone strikes that came through from Israel, and afterwards you saw those actual airborne from fighters shooting at things that were military targets. This time around, the Iranians were able to shoot down some of those airborne targets, and that shows that the Iranians were able to recover their defense systems, at least in that period of time. Now, I want to get into the United States' reaction, and then we can get into some of what Iran did in response, and then we can look a bit into the future, and then we can talk about the background and the future over on locals. But when it comes to the State Department's reaction, we saw this very shortly after the attacks. From Israel, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said, tonight Israel took unilateral action. Some people are confused to what that means. That just means Israel acted alone, basically. Israel took unilateral action against Iran. He goes on, we are not involved in strikes against Iran, and our top priority is protecting American forces in the region. Israel advised us that they believe this action was necessary for its self-defense. President Trump and the administration have taken all necessary steps to protect our forces and remain in close contact with our regional partners. Let me be clear, Iran should not target U.S. interests or personnel. A couple things to take note of in this statement that are very important is that this many parts of this actually gets contradicted by later statements from the Israelis and even from President Trump, which I'll mention in a second. But he mentions we are not involved at all in strikes against Iran. Well, I think just the nature of the United States' relationship with Israel makes them involved to some extent due to the massive amount of military equipment that the Israelis get from us, the military funding they get from us, but also the defense that we provide them. Israel is not able to conduct these strikes without the security of the United States protecting them from retaliation to some extent. Iran has to keep that in mind when retaliating, that the United States has the backing of Israel. And so, there's this common conservative talking point that the United States should stay out of foreign wars, that we should ignore this situation. Well, the fact is that we are involved. It's really the question is really to what extent are we going to be involved and how are we going to assert our power from the United States' perspective. So that's a bit of an issue, I will say, and that has to be kept in mind. I want to look at President Trump's statement, which is very different, I will say, and it's very Trumpian in its tone and structure. So we'll switch over to President Trump. Of course, these are two very different figures as well. We have to remember President Trump and Marco Rubio, very different personalities. But it's also important to look at the substance of what is actually being said. So looking over at President Trump's statement he made on Truth Social, he says, I gave Iran chance after chance to make a deal. I told them in the strongest of words to, quote, just do it, end quote. But no matter how hard they tried, no matter how close they got, they couldn't get it done. The background of that is the demanding of Iran to close their nuclear program, which we'll talk more about, really the demands that each of these countries have been making in their negotiations. He goes on, I told them it would be much worse than anything they know, anticipated, or were told, that the United States makes the best and most lethal military equipment anywhere in the world by far, and that Israel has a lot of it, with much more to come. So here there's an implicit mention here of the United States is involved to some extent with the Israeli strikes, just in the equipment even. He goes on, and they know how to use it. Certain Iranian hardliners spoke bravely, but they didn't know what was about to happen. They're all dead now, and it will only get worse. There has already been great death and destruction, but there is still time to make this slaughter, with the next already planned attacks being even more brutal, come to an end. Iran must make a deal before there is nothing left, and save what was once known as the Iranian Empire. No more death, no more destruction. Just do it before it's too late. God bless you all. Bit of a confusing statement, and I'll point out why. Firstly, this does make it seem, whether implicit or even explicitly, that Donald Trump knew about these strikes and even approved of them much earlier than, let's say, last week. Marco Rubio said that the Israelis simply advised them, this is what we think it needs to be done. Uh, Donald Trump's words here make it seem like he knew this was going to happen during the entirety of the negotiations and that he saw this as an option. And makes it and does seem to implicate himself and his administration in those strikes, which is not something I really understand why he would do. Maybe our audience can put in the comments why you think he would have said this and sort of implicated himself. Um, it also doesn't make sense to me in a number of other ways. The first is the idea that there could actually be a deal in the future now. The escalation has gone to an extent that this is really no turning back unless something really extraordinary happens. Iran has already said they're not going to have these negotiations anymore, and there are different elements in the Iranian government that are, more hardline, less hardline. But the fact is that Israel did. For whatever one thinks of the Iranian government, and certainly they're an Islamist government. I'm a Catholic. We're not, we don't see eye to eye on things, and there's brutalities that this theocratic regime has done, theocratic in the Muslim sense. But certainly their sovereignty did get challenged. It did get violated. You have civilian scientists being eliminated in these strikes. You have civilian areas being hit by these Israeli strikes. And of course, even just the military being targeted, the nuclear, the potential of the nuclear strikes, targets being hit, and then massive catastrophe from that. This is a challenge against Iranian sovereignty and their safety. They're not going to just simply let that fly and let that go on. Their only deterrent against future strikes, and we'll talk about this more on locals, is their nuclear capability. That's the only deterrent they really have, and to keep their regime in place. If the regime wants to stay in place, they need that nuclear deterrent. I simply don't see how this will make them more willing to come back to the table and negotiate. So, all in all, I think it's just a bit confusing. I don't think this statement makes a whole lot of sense. I don't think there will be any more negotiations. I think it's worrisome that Trump seems to have known about this and approved of it ahead of time. It almost seems to suggest that we've talked about this before, how there's these two factions, the restrainers and the neoconservatives. Neoconservatives represented by men like Mark Levin, while a restrainer would be represented by somebody like J.D. Vance or Pete Hegseth, trying to keep the United States out of the war. It seems Donald Trump might have favored the more pro-Zionist, pro-Israeli neoconservatives rather than the restrainers trying to keep the United States out of the war. So very confusing on that end. This got even more confusing after we saw the Israeli response, which did say that the U.S. simply pretended to seek negotiations so that Iran would lower its guard and so that Israel could go in and strike with even greater violence and force. That in and of itself makes Trump's statement even more perplexing, because you have to ask, well, does that mean that Donald Trump was wanting he simply did this he pretended to seek negotiations, ruined his credibility in those negotiations, lowered Iran's guard, had this heavy attack in order to eliminate Iran, but all of that's oriented towards seeking a negotiation and diplomatic resolution? I don't think that's the case. I simply think what's more likely is that certain elements in the Trump administration were working with the Israelis, were supporting the Israelis in this upcoming strike. I think everybody probably knew about it, but certain elements didn't support it explicitly. So you have then multiple people within the Pentagon, multiple people within the Trump administration, really working on pursuing the deal for different ends. I think Trump did want to make a deal, at least if we go by his word and his campaign promises, wanting to keep us out of a war. I think he wanted to see a diplomatic resolution, didn't want to see this strike happen. But it's my instinct to think that the so-called deep state really was on the Israeli military side rather than on the restrainers side, trying to keep us out of the war. Like, the most charitable vision of Trump would be that he didn't want this to happen, didn't know about this happening, but people in his administration undermined him. That's the most charitable view. Now, moving on to the Iranian counterattack. Uh, Immediately, there was some question as if they were even going to be able to mount a counteroffensive at all. It was my initial reaction that Iran would do nothing and would go to the negotiating table simply because we saw hours pass of there seeming to be nothing that occurred. Now we know why that is. We'll get to that. But they were eventually able to release about 100 to 300 ballistic missiles. These arrived very quickly, and they are very difficult to intercept. And I want to give our audience, who probably have heard some things about the Israeli defense apparatus, I want to give them the full picture of this. We usually speak of the Israeli missile defense system in terms of the Iron Dome. Now, the Iron Dome is not their only defense system, and you might have seen this mentioned in even mainstream outlets, but they have other things called the Arrow system. They have things called the David Sling, and they even have some missile defense systems from the United States when it comes to our warships or different interceptors from the United States as well. But speaking about the Iron Dome is not able to intercept those ballistic missiles. Those are intended for short range missiles from Gaza, Hamas sending missiles over, or from Lebanon, something like Hezbollah. That's what it was intended for. It's also it can strike these drones. We see these are larger drones than something like a quadcopter that you go buy at Best Buy or something. These are large drones. The Iron Dome is often used to strike against those as well. Those often come from the Houthis in Yemen. And the Iron Dome is able to strike at those. What is often used against these ballistic missiles is something called David Sling and Arrow. Now, this is not, as is commonly reported, or is at least commonly thought of in the minds of the West, is being 100% effective. It certainly is not, and this is proven to be the case because at least 7 of those ballistic missiles did hit their targets, and it seems that more of that has happened, especially in the here in the United States, at least last night's attacks on Israel from these missiles. It seems even more targets were hit. Significant targets were hit as well. We know that the Israeli Defense Ministry, which is their version of the Pentagon, was hit in Tel Aviv by one of these ballistic missiles. So they weren't intercepted. It didn't happen. And also there's reports, even though it's a bit conflicting, that a hypersonic missile, which is even more difficult to intercept than a ballistic missile, hit the Dimona nuclear reactor, the nuclear plant, that's a major target Iran was looking to hit, and it seems that they did. At least there is conflicting reports. We don't know the entire extent of it. But what is proven is that many of these missiles are hitting their target. There have been casualties. There have been people being wounded. It's also important to note that in order to use the David Sling, the Arrow system, these things are very expensive. Each time you see a video on television or looking at a clip, you will see these interceptors fly up and try to strike at those missiles. That's extremely expensive every time that has to be done. And the United States simply does not make a lot of those interceptors. There's a limited amount, and the Iranians, as I'm getting into now, actually have a whole lot more of those missiles, and we're intending to fire a whole lot more at Israel. I'm going to quote this. I found this first on it was a direct report from the ground. It was reported that the IRGC intended to fire at the Ayatollah's command about 1,000 ballistic missiles at Israel. However, due to Mossad, that's the covert operations of Israel, sabotage and a relentless air campaign, that was not immediately feasible. Many entrances of large underground cities storing missiles were struck, making it impossible to access them. However, the bases remain intact, and it will most likely be used once the entrances are fixed. And so we think about what would have happened if Iran sent 1,000, 2,000 ballistic missiles all at once, completely overran the Israeli defense structure. You could have seen a whole lot more damage, and they only sent about 1 to 300. So the potential for this war is absolutely devastating, and we don't know how this will play out today or even in the coming weeks. Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, the leader of Israel, the prime minister of Israel, has stated that this is going to go on, the Israeli strikes, for weeks until they manage to get their end. Which what they want is they want the Iranian government to have experienced regime change, to have a new regime put in. It's not as simple as just getting rid of the nuclear facilities. The Israeli goal is to get rid of the Iranian regime. That's why if you look at some of the more propaganda outlets like Fox News, for example, these outlets have now moved to talking about Iran is attacking civilians, therefore the Iranians need to have regime change. And we'll go into more on locals, how that actually could come about, how the Israelis need to bring that about. The way this war is going to go, in short, is you're going to see a this for that pattern going forward, as we've seen. I think you will see Iran trying to overwhelm the Israeli missile defense system. Israel is going to continue to try to behead the Iranian society by looking to assassinations, looking to attack their energy facilities, make things miserable for the Iranians. They're also, it seems, their strategy is to try to start a revolution in Iran. I don't think there's enough popular support behind that. I've seen no real data to support that. I've seen actually a lot to the contrary. And so that's how this war is going to play out. Now, some might be asking, this is a Catholic channel. What does this have to do with Catholicism? It has a lot to do with Catholicism. Of course, Israel is located, the state of Israel is located in the Holy Land, where our Lord walked. And I will also say much of this conflict springs from naturalism in the West, allowing this conflict to foster. And we'll talk about how that has gone about, how this conflict has progressed like this. And this is something that Catholics tend to get censored for talking about, simply because Catholics have always, when talking about this, been able to speak with the full picture. They're able to speak about the Jewish nation and the Islamic nations with utter clarity, because they're not serving one of those masters. They're serving a different master, which is Jesus Christ. So we're going to be looking at the history of this conflict, going back a long time. We're going to be looking at giving an overview for what might happen in the future, and also looking at some scripture in order to get a further understanding of this. We're also going to have articles frequently on this topic over at CatholicFamilyNews.com. I will also have in the link in the description a show notes for this episode, where we're going to have some reading, some recommended reading for anybody who's interested in learning more about this. And you can get access to our paper with exclusive articles on this, get access to many lectures where we've talked about this issue in particular over there on Locals, and so much more. You get access to the early access to the monthly paper, all of our lectures, so much more. So if you want to see this full video, go over to CatholicFamilyNews.locals.com. We'll talk about it over there, and I hope to see you there. May God grant you many joyful years.